Imagine dawn spreading across the endless steppe, painting the sky in shades of peach and gold. The sun rises above the horizon, and with its rays, the world awakens from the shadows. Can you feel the air filling with the scent of warm earth and dew? This is the breath of antiquity, a moment when history was just beginning to weave its threads. How did civilization emerge when the first stone was laid in the foundation of a city and the first plough tore up the earth? How did a world emerge where labor was not just an occupation, but the very price of freedom? Reflect for a moment, and you will hear the whisper of the centuries inviting us on a journey through the darkest and brightest pages of human history. This is a story of strength, weakness, resilience, and hope. We stand on the threshold where the shadows of the past have not yet dissipated, and their contours shape the world we know today. Listen to the wind whisper through the millennia, carrying echoes of ancient kingdoms. Where the fertile valleys of the Euphrates and Tigris embraced the first cities, the idea was born that one person could belong to another. Not simply to serve, not simply to follow orders, but to be property, a thing whose life and labor belonged to its master. These were not savage tribes, but powerful civilizations, building temples and canals, governing vast territories. Here, slavery was part of the order, like the cycle of day and night, like the floods of rivers, captives of war, debtors, children born in bondage. Their fate was sealed. They were the foundation stones of these empires, invisible but irreplaceable. Their backs bent under the weight of labor, their hands created wealth that allowed rulers and priests to pray to the gods and build the cities whose ruins we find today. Imagine the scorching Mesopotamian sun scorching the earth and the quiet rustle of reeds along the riverbanks. In this harsh beauty, laws were formed that cemented the power of some over others. And when the first ships set out across the seas carrying goods and ideas, they carried this form of relationship with them. The route lay west to the shores of Hellas, where philosophy, democracy, and art were born amidst shining white temples and bustling agoras. But even here, under the gentle Mediterranean sky, slavery was an integral part of life. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, cities whose names still ring in our ears. Their citizens spoke of freedom, the right to vote, the greatness of the polis. But behind these lofty ideals stood millions of hands that knew no freedom, peasants tilling the land, slaves spinning thread and preparing food, artisans creating beautiful goods, builders erecting acropolises and stadiums. They were the invisible fabric on which the patterns of Greek civilization were woven. Unlike in Mesopotamia, here the origin of a slave wasn't always so rigidly defined. Often they were prisoners of war, pirates, or those who had lost everything as a result of economic upheaval. They might be educated and skilled, but they still remained property. Their lives might be better or worse, depending on their master, but the very condition of bondage remained constant. Look at the marble statues, the graceful vases, the austere lines of the temples. In each of them, invisible yet tangible, is the labor of thousands of people whose names have been erased by time. They were part of the mechanism that allowed Greek thinkers to contemplate the cosmos and warriors to defend their cities. And this legacy, this idea that there are people born to serve, permeated the very foundations of Western thought. Even those who spoke of equality often made exceptions, leaving this form of coercion as self-evident. Listen to the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the wind carrying the scent of salt and resin. These ancient seas witnessed the first great migrations of people, and with them traveled new forms of social relations. From the Middle Eastern kingdoms, where slavery was deeply ingrained in laws and traditions, to the Greek city-states, where it became an integral part of their turbulent lives, the idea of one person owning another took root. These roots were deep, and their branches will extend far into the future, preparing for new, even darker turns in history. Rome, the heart of the world, pulsating with power and ambition. But beneath the radiance of its triumphal arches, beneath the glitter of legionary helmets, lurked a shadow. The shadow of millions. It was the shadow of slavery, invisible, yet permeating every stone, every thread of life in the great empire. Listen as the echo of footsteps on the pavements of the eternal city dissolves in the whispers of the slaves whose hands built its greatness. The Roman Empire wasn't the first to open this chapter of human history, but it elevated it to an absolute. Slavery here wasn't simply a consequence of war or debt, it became its foundation. Millions of people captured in countless campaigns, sold to pay debts, born in bondage, formed the core of the workforce. From the endless fields of Italy, where colossi toiled under the scorching sun, to the bustling workshops and quarries, their sweat fueled the economy. Their silent labor supported the luxury of the patricians and the ambitions of the emperors. Imagine vast latifundia where thousands of slaves worked the land. Their hands, roughened by hoes and plows, transformed barren lands into fertile fields, feeding millions. They mined ore in dark mines, their breath mingling with dust and fear. They served in the homes of the rich, performing the most humiliating and difficult duties. Their lives were not their own, they were objects, property, their bodies and souls belonging to their masters. But slavery in Rome wasn't limited to physical labor. Educated slaves captured during conquests became teachers, doctors, scribes, and architects. They brought with them knowledge and skills, enriching the empire's culture. But even their intellect remained in chains. They might create masterpieces, teach children, and heal the sick, but they always remained inferior to free men. Their fate depended on their master's whim, his mood, and his generosity. Imagine a Roman marketplace. The noise, the hubbub, the shouts of traders, and among them, people. They stood there, exposed for sale, their bodies examined like merchandise, their past, their dreams, their hopes, all erased, their future determined by the price a new owner would pay for them. It was commonplace, a part of everyday life, unquestioned. Roman law, so perfect in other respects, legalized this situation. A slave was an object of law, not a subject. He could not be killed without cause, but his life was entirely in the hands of his master. He could not own property, could not marry, could not have children who would be his own. His existence was completely subordinated to the will of another. And this mechanism, this gigantic conveyor belt of slave labor, fed the heart of the world. It allowed Rome to build aqueducts, roads, and amphitheaters. It allowed its legions to march across conquered territories. It allowed its philosophers to reflect and its poets to create. But behind every triumph, behind every great achievement, stood millions of silent victims. Consider the construction of the Colosseum. How many hands, how many lives were invested in this grand amphitheater where the blood of gladiators was spilled? How many slaves toiled within its depths, keeping it functioning? Their names are forgotten, but their labor remains embodied in stone, testifying to the dark side of greatness. The winds of history carried not only the empire's glory, but also its pain. Slavery became not just part of the Roman economy, but also part of its culture, its worldview. It permeated the social fabric, creating a hierarchy where freedom was a privilege, not a right. This idea, deeply rooted in the Roman consciousness, would live on for centuries, transforming but never disappearing. And so, against the backdrop of this majestic yet cruel world, the world stood still. No one knew that this foundation, seemingly unshakable, would one day begin to crack. The great empire, built on the bones of millions, was preparing for its final days, and with it, for new, even darker chapters in the history of forced labor. The Roman Empire, that colossus whose shadows stretched from the cold waters of Britain to the hot sands of Africa, began its slow decline. Its grandeur, built on the sweat and tears of millions, became fragile like an old mosaic whose pieces began to crumble. The sky above Rome, so recently blazing with triumphal lights, began to be covered with grey clouds. The empire seemed to be hibernating, as if before a long winter's slumber, but in this silence, new forms of slavery were emerging, more hidden, more sophisticated. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the year 101 AD, the familiar world collapsed. Great cities were deserted, roads built by slave labor began to grow over. Great domains, once ruled by a single hand, fragmented into numerous small, warring territories. The land that had once belonged to the mighty empire now fell into the hands of the leaders of Germanic tribes, who were battering its once impenetrable walls. And with these tribes came a new order, a new view of labor and property. This was a time when the very concept of slavery began to change. Free men, once proud of their Roman citizenship, now sought the protection of local leaders, offering them their loyalty and labor in exchange for safety. Thus arose the system of feudalism, where land became the highest value and the people living on it an integral part of it. Bonded to the land, serfs could not leave without their master's permission. They were obligated to work for him, to hand over a portion of the harvest, and to perform numerous duties. Their lives, although not as disenfranchised as those of a Roman slave, were nonetheless limited, subject to the will of the feudal lord. The church, which became one of the main pillars of the new society, also played a dual role. On the one hand, it preached mercy and equality before God. On the other, it sanctified the existing order, including forced labor. Monasteries themselves became large landowners, ruling over their peasants, who were often no different from the serfs of secular feudal lords. The church wielded enormous power, and it did not hesitate to use it. The Middle Ages, a time of knights and castles, cathedrals and pilgrimages, was also a time when coercion was merely changing its garb. Slavery, in its classical Roman sense, began to decline, but in its place, new forms of dependence flourished. Serfdom, bound to the land, was just one example. There were others. Cities, slowly rising from the ashes, began to attract people seeking freedom from feudal servitude. But even there, within the city walls, life was not easy. Guild masters controlled production, restricting access to crafts, establishing their own rules. Journeymen and apprentices spent years in toil before gaining the opportunity to become full members of the guild. New forms of coercion also emerged in other spheres. Military campaigns and the Crusades brought new waves of enslavement. Captives captured in battle were often sold into slavery. This was especially true on the borders of Europe, where clashes with Muslim states or pagan tribes were frequent. Slaves captured in such conflicts could end up in the markets of Constantinople, Cordoba, or even distant Rus. Even among those considered free, forms of dependence existed. Debtors unable to repay their debts could fall into debt slavery, trading their labor for the debts. This system, although not hereditary like serfdom, nevertheless trapped people in the grip of poverty and dependence. Amid this slow decline of old forms and the emergence of new ones, the world prepared for the next, even more dramatic turn. The shadow of slavery seemed to recede, only to take on a new, more menacing form, poised to leap across oceans. The winds of change, just beginning to rustle the leaves of European forests, carried with them the harbinger of a storm that would alter the course of history. In this world, where land and labor were inextricably linked, a thirst for new lands, new resources was brewing, and this thirst would soon lead to the most terrible chapters in human history. The sea. Boundless, powerful, alluring, it has always been a border, a wall that only a few dared to cross. But now, something has changed. In the hearts of Europeans tired of the cramped old world, the eternal struggle for a scrap of land, for a meager harvest, for the right to breathe deeply, a new, irresistible thirst has been born. A thirst for the horizon, a thirst for the unknown. The ships, which until recently had timidly glided along familiar shores, now grew bolder. Their sails, like the wings of unknown birds, filled with the wind, carrying them away into the blue abyss. These were not mere voyages. They were a cry from the soul, breaking free from the shell of centuries. The old sins, the shadow of slavery that had lingered through the centuries, had not disappeared. They were simply biding their time, their new playing field. And so, the first steps into the Atlantic. It was a time when world maps were still full of blank spots, when legends of lands brimming with gold and wonders excited the imagination. Portugal, then Spain. Their caravels, light and maneuverable, became harbingers of great change. They explored the shores of Africa, sought a sea route to India, dreaming of spices, silks, and jewels. But behind the romantic veneer of great discoveries lurked a different, far darker reality. Alongside cartographers and navigators, those who saw the new lands as mere labor sources also advanced. Encounters with the peoples of Africa, with their rich culture and distinctive identity, often ended in tragedy. The first captives, the first slaves taken from Africa, were not yet recognized as part of a monstrous machine about to reach full capacity. These first steps into the Atlantic were steps into the unknown. The wind filling the sails carried not only the hope of wealth and glory, but also the scent of impending doom. The world seemed frozen, not yet aware that a new, brutal order, built on the bones of millions, was about to be born. Old dreams of freedom and new ambitions wove themselves into a tight knot, ready to unravel in a bloody drama. And above it all, a boundless, indifferent sky stretched as if observing the birth of a new era. Silence seemed to envelop the world before time sped up again. As if lurking, it was gathering strength for new, unprecedented events. It was at this moment, when horizons expanded and old maps seemed insufficient, that a page written in pain and despair opened. The transatlantic tragedy, whose name had become synonymous with inhuman cruelty, was about to unfold in all its horrific fullness. The Middle Passage, that was the name given to this hellish route, this machine grinding human destinies. It did not arise suddenly like a thunderstorm on a summer's day. Its roots went deeper into soils that had already known the weight of slavery, but now they were about to acquire a new, monstrous dimension. European ships, those bold Atlantic pioneers, carried not only the flags of great powers, but also the seeds of a new, predatory enterprise. When Portuguese and Spanish explorers first set foot on African soil, they saw more than just exotic landscapes and unfamiliar peoples. They also saw a potential labor force, a resource that could be exploited for enrichment. Encounters that could have become a dialogue of cultures often turned into capture, violence, and abduction. People whose ancestors had lived in harmony with their land for centuries suddenly found themselves hunted. These first captives, torn from their familiar world, could not yet imagine the scale of the coming catastrophe. They were merely the first seeds sown on the field of future tragedy. The Middle Passage wasn't just a geographical concept. It was a term encompassing the entire horrific process, from the moment a person was captured in their home to their arrival on ships ready to cross the ocean. The air in West African ports, once filled with the sounds of life, the laughter of children, and the songs of adults, began to be saturated with the scent of fear and despair. The rough hands of European traders, and sometimes even the local chieftains who collaborated with them, seized men, women, and children. They were bound, beaten, and stripped of everything that made them human. The eyes of those who remained revealed horror mixed with bewilderment. How could this have happened? Why were they, free people, being turned into commodities? Then came the most terrifying stage, loading onto the ships. Unsanitary conditions, stench, and stuffiness reigned. The cramped holds, where hundreds of people were herded, became a veritable agony. People lacked air, water, and food. They were chained together, shackled to their neighbors, separated only by thin wooden partitions. Breathing became labored, every movement brought pain. Many succumbed to this ordeal before the ships even left the shore. Their bodies, exhausted and worn out, were discarded into the ocean like useless trash. Those who remained lived in constant fear, awaiting the next blow, the next dose of humiliation. The sound of the waves gently lapping against the ship's side sounded like a death sentence to the captives. The ocean, which for sailors had been a path to new lands and riches, had become an abyss leading into the unknown. The Middle Passage was a one-way journey. There was no turning back. These ships, these floating prisons, carried human cargo across the Atlantic, and this cargo was the most precious of all: human lives. The sailors carrying out their captain's orders often didn't consider the morality of what was happening. They saw only their work, their duty, but even among them there were probably those who, in the quiet hours of the night, gazing at the stars, felt the weight of their role in this monstrous undertaking. The holds were so cramped that people were forced to lie huddled together, unable to even turn around. Women and children were often abused by the crew. Diseases such as scurvy, dysentery, and smallpox spread with terrifying speed. Each outbreak meant the death of dozens, if not hundreds, of people. But even the loss of so much merchandise didn't stop the slave traders. They knew the demand for new labor in America was enormous, and every death meant lost profits that had to be compensated. The journey could last weeks, sometimes even months. The sun blazing through the cracks in the deck brought no relief, only intensifying the thirst and suffering. The smells of rot, sweat, and excrement hung in the air, making breathing nearly impossible. People lost consciousness from suffocation, their bodies convulsing. Some fell into apathy, resigned to their fate. Others, despite exhaustion, tried to resist, fought with the guards, and tried to break free, even if that freedom meant death. But the odds were unequal. The cruelty and cold indifference of the slavers broke any spirit. Each such ship crossing the Atlantic was a monument to human greed and inhumanity. It was a meticulously rigged system where every cog, from the captain to the humble sailor, played a role in this machine of suffering. The Middle Passage became a symbol of one of the darkest chapters in human history, a road paved with tears, blood, and broken lives. Wave after wave, ships sailed west, leaving behind the devastated shores of Africa and carrying on their decks millions of people whose dreams of freedom had been shattered by the harsh realities of a slave-owning world. The ocean, so vast and powerful, bore witness to this unprecedented tragedy, keeping in its depths the secrets of those who never reached the shores of the New World. The world stood still, as if on the threshold of a new, terrible era where human life became a bargaining chip in the game of power and wealth. A change of era approaches like a breath of wind across the steppe. America's slave colonies, the birth of a new era, sugar, tobacco, and human destinies. While the ocean held its secrets, a new world was being born to the west, beyond the horizon. Lands that had once been wild and untamed now absorbed not only the sweat and blood, but also the hopes, fears, and very essence of those brought here against their will. Here, in the North American colonies, history took a sharp turn. Not only the British Empire, but also France, Spain, and the Netherlands all rushed to these shores, driven by a thirst for new riches. The Spanish were the first to set foot on the lands that would later become the United States, but it was the English settlers who arrived in the early 17th century who laid the foundations of what we know today as the Slave South. The first years were harsh. The settlers struggled with the unknown, the wild and disease. They needed labor to develop these lands, to grow the crops that would bring them prosperity. At first, these were mostly European indentured servants, people who had traded their years of labor in exchange for passage across the ocean. But this wasn't enough. The land demanded more hands, more backs, ready for hard labor. And so their gaze turned south to the tropical islands, where plantations were already thriving. The Caribbean islands became the first laboratory. Here, in Barbados, Jamaica, and St. Dominic, the full potential of sugarcane was realized. Sugar. The word became synonymous with wealth and luxury in Europe, but for those who cultivated it, it symbolized unbearable labor and cruelty. Sugar plantations required enormous labor. The weather was debilitating, disease decimated the people, and the labor was truly hellish. The Spanish, and then the English, French, and Dutch began importing slaves from Africa. Their numbers grew every year, eclipsing the European population. It was here, on the islands, that exploitative methods were perfected. Cruelty became the norm. Laws written to regulate slavery cemented it as a system. Slaves became property, objects to be bought, sold, punished, and even killed without much consequence. Their families were torn apart, their culture suppressed, their humanity denied. It was a cruel experiment that soon spread to the mainland. When English colonists in North America, especially in Virginia, saw how profitable tobacco growing could be, they too began seeking labor. Tobacco, like sugar, required large areas and constant care. By the late 17th century, as the flow of European indentured servants began to decline and African slaves became more readily available, and, as slave traders believed, more suited to the tropical climate, slavery became the dominant form of labor on southern plantations. This wasn't just an economic decision, it was the birth of a new social structure, a new order based on racial discrimination. Skin color became a marker of destiny. People arriving from Africa were declared inferior, deprived of rights, destined for eternal servitude. The world being created on these lands was built on the foundation of alien suffering. Each new ship arriving from Africa brought not only a living cargo but also a fresh wave of grief. People uprooted from their familiar lives, their homes thousands of miles away, now found themselves in a completely alien world. Their languages, their customs, their beliefs, all were under pressure, trying to be eradicated. But the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. In the darkest corners of slave life, amid grueling labor and cruelty, songs, stories, and faith lived on. As plantations grew, so did the demand for slaves. Colonies such as Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia became centers of the slave economy. Sugar from the Caribbean and tobacco from the Americas brought enormous profits to the mother country. These riches, however, came at an exorbitant price. Laws regulating slavery became increasingly harsh. Some colonies adopted black codes that deprived slaves of even the most basic rights. They were forbidden to study, to assemble, to own property, or even to defend themselves from violence. Any disobedience was harshly punished. This was an attempt to completely dehumanize, to turn people into mere instruments for profit. But even in this abyss of despair, people found ways to resist. This could include slowing down work, sabotage, escape, or, in the most extreme cases, armed rebellion. The sparks of freedom ignited at the heart of the slave system never completely died out. They smoldered, biding their time, a reminder that even in chains, the human soul yearns for freedom. Thus was born a new era in America. An era where the wealth of some was built on the bondage of others. An era where human life became a commodity and race a death sentence. A world that only yesterday had seemed boundless and full of opportunity now took on contours forged in pain and oppression. This was the beginning of a path that would lead to unprecedented upheaval. Imagine fields stretching to the horizon, bathed in a sun that seemed both a blessing and a curse. These were lands where a person's life was measured not by the years lived, but by the harvest reaped. Here, under the watchful eye of overseers, lived those whose fates were forever intertwined with chains. Their life was simple and harsh, marked by constant labor from dawn to dusk. Every morning began with a hum that echoed across the plantations. Footsteps, voices, the sounds of instruments. The humid air was permeated with the scent of earth, sweat, and sometimes the bitter aroma of spices destined for distant markets. Slave dwellings were modest, often simple huts, where the cramped conditions were not only physical but also spiritual. Families, often separated by an invisible but insurmountable wall of laws, found solace in shared sorrows and rare joys. Work on the plantations was grueling. Sugarcane fields required tireless tending from planting to harvesting, often fraught with danger. The knives used to cut the stalks could cause injury. Work in sugar mills was even more dangerous, where the heat of ovens and the roar of machinery posed a constant threat. Tobacco plantations, while less physically demanding, required long hours under the scorching sun, bending over low-growing plants. In this harsh reality, where every day was a struggle for survival, people found strength. The songs that sang in the evenings as the sun set concealed melancholy but also hope. These melodies, passed from mouth to mouth, were a bridge between the past and the future, between a lost homeland and the dream of freedom. Stories, passed in the shade of the trees, told of heroes, of wise ancestors, of a time when chains had not yet shackled feet. Faith also played a vital role. Secret prayers to heaven provided comfort and strength. Even in the darkest moments, when it seemed the entire world had forgotten them, they believed that justice would one day prevail. This inner strength, this unbending spirit, was something that could not be taken away. resistance took many forms. It could be quiet and unnoticed, slowing the pace of work, accidental tool breakages, hiding part of the harvest, all were part of the game of survival. Sometimes it involved more daring acts, escapes. Nights became a time of hope for those who dared to flee, relying on the stars and the help of hidden allies. Each successful escape was a small victory that fueled the spirit of others. Meetings, even brief ones, were precious. People exchanged news and supported each other. They learned to understand each other, even if their languages differed. This community, born in captivity, became a source of strength. They shared meager food, helped the sick, and comforted the grieving. Sometimes, when despair reached its limit, rebellions broke out. These were moments when pent-up rage burst forth. These uprisings, though often brutally suppressed, left an indelible mark. They reminded the oppressors that even in the most difficult circumstances, the human spirit strives for freedom. Each such rebellion, each sacrifice, became part of legend, inspiring those who lived after. The air above the plantations was often filled with the silence that preceded a thunderstorm. It was a tense stillness, as if time itself stood still, anticipating the events to come. People lived, worked, loved, and suffered, but somewhere deep inside, hope always glimmered. Hope that one day the chains would be broken and the sun would shine equally for everyone. And every dawn, despite the harsh reality, brought the promise of a new day, and with it, the opportunity for change. A change of era approaches like a breath of wind across the steppe. Economics and ideology, these are the two invisible threads that intertwine to justify injustice, to make slavery, that heavy burden, the natural order of things. Oppressors, to consolidate their power, needed justification. They didn't simply capture people, they sought ways to convince themselves and others that it was right. At first, these were simple, primitive explanations. If one person is weak and another is strong, then the strong has the right to rule over the weak. If one people is defeated by another, then the vanquished must serve the victors. Thus arose the first justifications, simple as the crack of a whip. But as civilizations developed, as societies became more complex, these justifications became more sophisticated. Philosophers, those who were supposed to seek truth, suddenly found it in justifications for the existing order. They spoke of a natural hierarchy where some are born to rule and others to serve. They pointed to differences in appearance, ability, and culture, declaring them proof of the inferiority of some and the superiority of others. For example, in ancient Greece, where freedom and democracy for citizens were valued, slavery was the norm. It was considered natural, necessary for maintaining the well-being of the polis. Slaves were talking tools, whose lives and labors were entirely in the hands of their masters. Philosophers like Aristotle reasoned that some people were naturally destined to be slaves, and that subordination to them brought them benefit. This was an elegant but cruel justification, which allowed many to live in luxury at the expense of others suffering. The Roman Empire, built on the strength of the legions, also relied on slave labor. Millions of people captured in wars were sold in markets, becoming part of the vast machinery that powered the empire. Here, too, there were ideological justifications. The Romans believed in their special destiny, their civilizing mission. Those who did not share their culture, those who lived outside the empire, were considered barbarians, and their subjugation was seen as a blessing. This was a kind of civilizing mission, which, in essence, served as a justification for enslavement. When Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe, it would seem that the ideas of equality and love for one's neighbor should have put an end to slavery. but history decreed otherwise. The church, itself a major landowner, found itself in a difficult situation. Instead of completely condemning slavery, it began to seek a compromise. Sacred texts were interpreted in a way that did not contradict the existing order. It was stated that slaves should obey their masters as if they were God himself. This was a subtle but effective reinterpretation that allowed slavery to survive, albeit with some mitigations. Gradually, under the influence of Christianity, slavery in Europe began to transform into serfdom, where coercion was not as absolute, but still very strong. The new horizons opened by the great geographical discoveries brought with them old sins. When Europeans reached the shores of America, they encountered new peoples, but their attitudes toward them proved familiar. Initially, the Europeans attempted to enslave the indigenous populations. However, diseases to which the Indians had no immunity, and their knowledge of the local territory made them less than effective slaves for the Europeans. Then their gaze turned to Africa. The transatlantic tragedy known as the Middle Passage marked the apogee of this process. It was a hellish machine designed to move millions of people from Africa to the Americas. The ideology that justified it was particularly cynical. Africans were portrayed as inferior beings, incapable of independent existence, in need of guidance and civilization by Europeans. Their skin, their customs, their languages, all were declared signs of their barbarism and inferiority. The theory of the natural order took on a new racist form. Entire pseudo-scientific theories were created that proved the biological superiority of the white race over the black. These theories, devoid of any scientific basis, served as a powerful ideological weapon. They allowed slave traders and slave owners to look their victims in the eyes and see them not as people, but as property. They allowed politicians and judges to pass laws that entrenched this slavery, declaring it not only legal, but also necessary for the prosperity of the colonies. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the tobacco fields of North America, the mines of South America, all these places became symbols of brutal exploitation. Human destiny was transformed into a commodity, valued by muscle strength and endurance. Children were sold away from their parents, siblings were separated without mercy. The goal was not simply profit, but total subjugation, the destruction of the individual, the transformation of humans into biomass, capable only of following orders. This natural order benefited more than just slaveholders. It created the illusion of social mobility for poor Europeans, who, without slaves, could at least consider themselves superior to those in chains. It shaped new social structures in which racial superiority became one of the main criteria of status. The ideology of slavery permeated all spheres of life, painting the world in black and white, where some things were unconditionally good and others unconditionally evil, but these evils were considered immutable and necessary. Justifying injustice is a process that requires constant reinforcement, the constant repetition of false truths. It's like building a wall stone by stone, brick by brick, to shield oneself from the truth. And when this wall grows high enough, it begins to seem impenetrable. But even the strongest walls eventually crumble, especially when they are eroded by the inexorable passage of time and an awakening conscience. But even the strongest walls eventually crumble, especially when eroded by the inexorable passage of time and an awakening conscience. Where the silence of submission reigned, voices suddenly began to ring out. These were the voices of despair, the voices of anger, the voices of those who could no longer endure oppression. The spark of freedom, once barely noticeable, grew ever brighter, illuminating the shadows of slavery. Let us remember Spartacus. His name became synonymous with rebellion, a symbol of unyielding will. He was a gladiator, a man whose life belonged to others, whose body was an instrument for the amusement of the Roman nobility. But within him lived a thirst for freedom that proved stronger than the steel of his gladiator. Together with other gladiators, equally captive to fate, he led a rebellion. This was more than just an escape, it was a challenge to an entire system built on violence and exploitation. Thousands of slaves, heeding his call, joined him. They marched along the roads of Italy like a raging torrent, sweeping away Roman legions in their path. Their weapons were the tools at hand, their strength, despair, and the thirst for life. They wanted not simply to be free, they wanted to reclaim their right to be human. Rome, the heart of the world, shook from this rebellion. For the first time, the fragility of a majestic empire whose might rested on the backs of millions of enslaved people was so clearly revealed. Spartacus and his army fought not only for their own freedom, but for the freedom of all oppressed people. Although the uprising was brutally suppressed, its echoes lived on through the centuries as a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the flame of hope can ignite. Centuries passed, the world changed, but the chains of slavery seemed to only grow stronger, taking on new forms. In the colonial possessions of the New World, especially in the Caribbean, where sugar plantations demanded tireless labor, cruelty reached its apogee. Here, slavery was not just a system, but a way of life, an economic foundation. People brought from the shores of Africa faced unimaginable conditions. The day began before dawn and ended after sunset. Work on the plantations was grueling, monotonous, and dangerous. The sun blazed mercilessly, the air was permeated with the smell of sweat and earth. Every step, every movement was monitored. Punishments were harsh, often resulting in mutilation or death. But even in this hopeless life, the spirit of resistance did not fade. It began small, with quiet sabotage, with slowing the pace of work, with food carried into the forest. These were small victories that helped preserve human dignity. Then came bolder forms of protest, escapes. Individual or in groups, they became the stuff of legend. The escapees, or Marans as they were called, created their own communities in remote places, in forests, in the mountains. They lived by their own rules, preserving their culture and the memory of their homeland. These communities were a source of inspiration for those who remained in captivity and a constant headache for the slave owners. But the most striking manifestation of this struggle, the most powerful blow to the system of slavery, was the Haitian Uprising. It was more than just a slave rebellion. It was a revolution that changed the course of history. Beginning in 1791, it lasted for many years, turning into a bloody but heroic battle for freedom. Leaders like Toussaint Louverture became symbols of unwavering will and strategic genius. They were able to unite disparate groups of slaves, build an army, and resist the mightiest colonial powers, France, Spain, and England. Picture this scene: hot tropical air, dense jungle, smoke from cooking fires, but above it all, a tension hangs. You can hear the sound of drums calling to action, the rustling of leaves where fighters hide. This is not just a fight for freedom. It is a fight for the right to live, for the right to be human, for the right to determine one's own destiny. The Haitian Revolution was unique in that it resulted in the creation of the first free state founded by former slaves. It was a triumph of the human spirit over the cruelty of the system. Haiti became a beacon of hope for all the oppressed around the world. It proved that slavery is not eternal, that oppression can be overthrown. This victory was achieved at the cost of enormous sacrifice, but it left its mark on history forever, demonstrating that freedom is not a gift, but a right worth fighting for. The success of the Haitian Revolution inspired slaves and oppressed people around the world, fueling their desire for liberation. The struggle continued, taking different forms, but its essence remained constant: the desire for freedom, for justice, for dignity. From gladiatorial combat to plantations, from forests to sugarcane fields, the spark of freedom burned, waiting for its moment to become a flame. And this flame, once ignited, could never be extinguished. The Haitian Revolution, blazing with a bright light, illuminated not only the Caribbean islands, but also the minds of people around the world. It became a powerful argument in the never-ending debate about human dignity. While in some corners of the planet new nations were emerging, built on the ideals of freedom and equality, in others, such as the United States of America, the system of slavery continued to grow stronger, like an old tree with deep roots. But even in the darkest forests of history, sparks of hope flicker, and the quiet whispers of conscience gradually gain strength. In England, a country whose ships plied the oceans, bringing riches and new lands, voices began to call for rethinking. These were not the cries of revolutionaries, but rather the insistent yet calm words of enlightened thinkers, clergy, and politicians. William Wilberforce, a man of deep faith and unbending will, became one of the central figures of this movement. He saw slavery as a monstrous violation of divine and human law. Imagine the halls of Parliament where words spoken with conviction clash with arguments based on profit and habit. The air is filled with tension, but also with hope for change. Wilberforce and his associates, a group of saints as they were called, worked tirelessly, gathering evidence of the cruelty of the slave trade, delivering speeches that penetrated the hearts of their listeners. They formed committees, wrote petitions, published pamphlets, trying to get the truth out to anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, in the United States, the situation was more complex. Slavery was tightly woven into the fabric of the economy, particularly in the southern states, where cotton and tobacco plantations required a huge labor force. However, the ideas of the Enlightenment, reaching across the ocean, began to resonate here as well. Abolitionists emerged, people who openly advocated for the complete and immediate end of slavery. Among them were former slaves whose stories, filled with pain and suffering, were the most compelling testimony against this inhumane system. Frederick Douglass, with his keen intellect and eloquence, became one of the most powerful voices of the abolitionist movement. His speeches, his books, his life, all of it defiantly challenged injustice. Imagine him standing at the podium, his voice powerful and confident, recounting the horrors of slavery, the separation of families, the emptiness of an existence. The movement to abolish slavery gained momentum, like a stream collecting water from a hillside and turning into a full-flowing river. The first legislative initiatives emerged. In England, after years of struggle, a law banning the slave trade was passed in 1807. This was the first major victory, the echoes of which reverberated throughout the world. The act of the slave trade itself, the transport of people from Africa to America, was outlawed, but this did not immediately free those already enslaved. The struggle continued. In the United States, by contrast, the legislative path was more tortuous and painful. The rift between North and South over slavery deepened. Each new attempt to find a compromise only exacerbated the contradictions. However, public opinion gradually changed. People saw injustice, they heard stories, they read books. The atmosphere in society grew tense, as if before a storm. A significant milestone was the British Supreme Court's Somerset case decision in 1770. This precedent declared slavery illegal in England. This meant that any slave who set foot on English soil was automatically free. This was a significant achievement, though it did not abolish slavery in the colonies. Imagine the shadow of freedom falling on those who had lived under oppression, granting them hope for a new beginning. Gradually, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through fog, the realization that slavery was not just ineffective, but also deeply immoral, began to permeate public consciousness. Abolitionists used every available means. They organized rallies, distributed leaflets, and appealed to legislators. Every word, every action was aimed at awakening the nation's conscience. In 1833, after decades of bitter struggle, the British Empire passed the Slavery Abolition Act. This was a colossal event. Millions of people gained their freedom. This law, however, was not an instantaneous emancipation. It provided for a transition period during which slaves became apprentices, working for their former masters for a nominal fee. This was done to soften the economic blow to plantation owners. But the principle was established. Slavery was doomed. Imagine the sigh of relief that swept across the islands when news of this law reached their shores. In the United States, however, the situation unfolded differently. The abolition of slavery there followed the bloody Civil War, which began in 1861, but until then the freedom movement continued its journey, paving the way for future change. Every new step, every new testimony, every new voice calling for justice brought the dawn closer. This dawn was long and difficult, but it inevitably arrived, illuminating the path to a world where freedom would cease to be a rare flower and become the natural state of every person. The echo of conscience, once heard, grew stronger, and its voice could no longer be silenced. And so, when the last ember in the furnace of history seemed extinguished, when the glow of freedom that had timidly flickered in the British Empire and blazed like a bloody conflagration in America began to fade, leaving only smoke and ashes in its wake, we come to that part of the narrative where the past, like an invisible but sturdy anchor, continues to hold us, preventing us from moving forward freely. The legacy of slavery is more than just a chapter in a history book. It is deep, bleeding scars on the body of civilization itself, the imprints of pain and injustice that still echo in the present. Remember how carelessly humanity sometimes accepted slavery as a given, as the natural order of things. It was woven into the fabric of society, became the foundation of the economy, and was justified by philosophy itself. But behind the facade of this order lurked an abyss of suffering. Millions of lives were broken, crippled, erased from history. And even after the shackles were removed, these lives did not immediately find true freedom. Think of those who were torn from their homelands, whose families were torn apart, whose culture was suppressed. Imagine their descendants living on a land that never truly became their own. The scars of the past don't simply disappear. They are passed down from generation to generation, manifesting themselves in inequality, prejudice, and mistrust. These are not just historical facts, they are living pain that continues to shape people's lives, social structures, and political processes. Take, for example, the economic legacy. Many regions that had long built their prosperity on slave labor acquired immense wealth. This wealth, accumulated over centuries, did not disappear with the abolition of slavery. It continued to serve its owners, providing them with privileges and opportunities unavailable to those who had lost everything. This created and continues to create deep economic gaps that are difficult to overcome. Or consider the ideological legacy. Notions of racial superiority and justifications for discrimination that once undergirded slavery haven't disappeared without a trace. They've mutated, taking on new forms, but they continue to poison public consciousness, giving rise to new forms of oppression and injustice. It's an invisible wall that divides people, preventing them from seeing each other as equals. Even the planet's physical geography bears the marks of this tragedy. The shores of Africa, once full of life and joy, are now forever marked by the traces of the slave trade. The lands of the Americas, once wild and untamed, are now dotted with plantations built on the sweat and tears of slaves. These places, like monuments to the past, remind us of the price humanity paid for its greed and cruelty. Sometimes it feels like the past is breathing down our necks, whispering old, forgotten grievances. When we see acts of racism, when we hear words of hate, when we encounter systemic discrimination, we can feel the shadow of the past looming over us. These aren't just isolated incidents, they are manifestations of deep-rooted problems that demand our attention and reflection. Slavery left behind not only material destruction and social divisions, but also profound psychological trauma. Trauma that is passed down from generation to generation, affecting self-esteem, the sense of belonging, and the way people view the world. Imagine how difficult it is to live knowing that your ancestors were deprived of human dignity, that their lives were mere commodities. This pain, this injustice, this loss, all of it lives on in the hearts and minds of people. And so, standing at a crossroads, we are forced to acknowledge that the past haunts us. The scars of slavery are not just wrinkles on the face of history, they are open wounds that require healing. And this healing is only possible when we are willing to face the truth, when we are willing to acknowledge our responsibility, when we are willing to work to ensure the past is not repeated. This is a long and difficult journey, a journey toward true reconciliation and justice. But it is precisely this journey that leads us to the light, to a world where every person is free, where no one is oppressed, where the past serves as a lesson, not a condemnation. For only in this way can we truly move forward, leaving behind the shadows of the past and building a future based on respect, equality, and the dignity of every person. Every day we reflect on the legacy of slavery, we take a step toward understanding. We understand how deeply the past permeates our present, and this understanding is the first, but crucial, step toward healing. The silence that enveloped the world after the storm of change seems to pause before resuming its inexorable march. Time, as if holding its breath, prepares to seize new stories. In this frozen pause, when the past still smoulders and the future is only just emerging, we find space for reflection. The lessons of time are not just lines in dusty books. They are the echoes of millions of voices woven into the fabric of existence, the whispers of those who have known the weight of chains. Memory, this fragile mirror, reflects not only the greatness of civilizations but also their darkest failures. It demands of us not simply memorization but also a deep understanding. Reflecting on the dark pages of history is an act of courage. It is a gaze into the abyss where human dignity was trampled, where life was turned into a commodity and freedom became an unattainable dream. We see how, for centuries, echoes of pain have echoed from the depths of mines, from fields soaked in sweat and tears, from the decks of ships turned floating prisons. These images, like shadows, follow us, reminding us of the fragility of a world built on the suffering of others. Imagine this echo in our hearts. It's not a loud cry, but a quiet, insistent whisper that cannot be silenced. It reminds us that every era bears the seeds of both hope and despair. And how we manage this legacy determines our own future. Responsibility is a burden we bear, even if we weren't directly involved in the events. It's a responsibility to ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten, that their tragic pages are not repeated. Time doesn't just flow, it teaches us. It teaches us to see patterns, understand motives, and recognize consequences. In this silence, when the wind of change barely rustles the leaves, we hear the voice of our ancestors calling for vigilance. They know how easy it is to lose newfound freedom, how insidious new forms of coercion can be, how important it is to preserve the light of humanity. We stand on the threshold of understanding that the past is not dead weight, but a living force. It influences our views, our actions, our relationships. The scars left by slavery have not disappeared without a trace. They manifest themselves in inequality, in prejudice, in the invisible walls that continue to divide people. And until these scars are healed, until injustice is acknowledged and overcome, the world will remain incomplete. Memory isn't just pain, it's also strength. The strength of those who fought, who dreamed, who never gave up. It's an example of an unyielding spirit that breaks through the centuries like a sprout through asphalt. We draw wisdom, resilience, and hope from this legacy. Hope that understanding the past will lead us to a more just and humane present. It's slow, painstaking work to make sense of these dark pages. It requires honesty, openness, and a willingness to look at oneself in the mirror of history without embellishment. This is not a search for the guilty, but a search for understanding. An understanding of how human nature, in its complexity, is capable of both the greatest atrocities and the greatest kindness. In this silence, as the world stands still before a new dawn, we hear a quiet but insistent call, a call to responsibility. A call to remembrance, a call to healing, and it is a call we cannot ignore if we want to build a future worthy of us all. The path to understanding lies through acknowledgement of pain, acknowledgement of injustice, acknowledgement of our role in ensuring that these mistakes are never repeated. And in this slow but sure movement toward the light, we find the true lesson of time. And so, as the last echoes of the past fade into eternity, we stand on the threshold of a new dawn. The darkness that shrouded centuries dissipates, giving way to the quiet light of understanding. Every story, every breath, every tear shed in these ancient lands is now woven into a single fabric of time. In this silence, as the wind whispers forgotten names, we feel the weight of the journey. It is not a point, but rather a gentle transition, like a slow breath before a deep sleep. Like an ancient ship completing a long voyage, it moors to the shore, leaving behind only the measured breath of the waves. We look back, and the shadows of the past no longer frighten us. They merely remind us of strength, of resilience, of how even in the darkest times a spark of humanity could burn. Like the embers of a dying fire, they give off their warmth, illuminating the path forward. And we, standing on this earth, feel its breath, its memory, its peace. All is still, not before the storm, but before the quiet grandeur of completion. This is not the end, but merely the natural course of things, like the changing of the seasons, a sunset on the horizon of history, promising a new day. Only a deep, soothing knowledge remains, a knowledge that we carry within us as a priceless gift. It resounds quietly in our hearts, reminding us of the fragility of freedom and the inviolability of the human spirit. And in this quiet light of understanding, we find peace, like an ancient sage who comprehended the mystery of the universe. Let this memory remain with us, like the gentle whisper of our ancestors, guiding us. We inhale the air filled with the scent of millennia, and feel history breathing with us. Every step we take, every breath, every moment, all are part of eternity. And now, in this silence, we hear only the gentle beating of our own hearts, echoing the pulse of life itself. This is not a farewell, but rather an understanding that every moment, even the darkest, carries within itself a seed of light, and this light, quiet yet unquenchable, now illuminates our path. Like the last ray of sun touching ancient ruins, it gives them new life, new beauty. We stand at the threshold, and the past gives way to the future, leaving behind not just an echo, but a deep, calm knowledge. This knowledge we must cherish as the most precious treasure. And let it be our beacon, our guide in the days to come. History has ended, but its lessons live on. They live within us, in our hearts, in our yearning for the light. And this yearning, quiet yet powerful, will guide us through time. Like an ancient bell striking its final hour, it does not fall silent, but merely shifts to a different sound, filled with wisdom and peace. We inhale this peace, and it fills us to the brim. History has found its place, its quiet haven. And we, its listeners, its witnesses, depart with a feeling of profound satisfaction. Like a song sung to its end, it leaves behind only harmony, the quiet light of understanding, lessons we must not forget.